we're still at the time for you to start talking. So.
All right, well then, good, then I won't talk fast, I can talk at a normal pace. This is a much shorter presentation than a lot of mine as well. I didn't try to cover all of the plants that we use in our rain gardens because I'd have to move through them at a rate of like 1 every 5 seconds, so I just hit the highlights. So I'm Shannon Brown, and my company is ERA Native Land or Ecosystem Regeneration Artisans. Our company is focused on uniting talented land stewards to complete projects that realize the vision of creating healthy habitat and healthy ecological communities. We work on residential rainscapes and have also started to do work doing wildlife management for large acreage ranches, checking off those boxes for the 1D1 wildlife exemption. We're focused on earth care and people care. What's good for the earth is good for people. We want to have water here. Pretty basic, you know, just making sure everybody can have something to drink. We use native plants to provide wildlife habitat for pollinators and birds. And then sometimes we have clients that are like, well, I really want to have something for me to eat too. Let's have some sweet potatoes. Let's have some figs. Let's grow some mustard greens. So we'll do that as well. Almost every single project we do involves some way of harvesting stormwater or managing stormwater. We want to make the most of the rain that falls. What was that thing we said at the beginning? Slow the water down. Y'all come on with me. Slow the water down, spread the water out, sink the water in. Great. So if you remember nothing else from today, that's the one. You'll be like, you know, waking up tomorrow morning, you'll be like, slow the water down, spread the water out, sink the water in. That's what we got to do. So, and the reason that's so important, like I mentioned before, is the danger is twofold. Water that runs off creates flash flooding. That mostly affects people that live near the creeks and rivers. But even if you live on top of a hill, you don't want your hilltop to be a dry tinderbox. So when we slow the water down and sink it into the hills here, that helps the whole community and it helps the trees and native plants in your area thrive. Rain gardens are amazing, and I fell in love with this technique, not only because of the broader good for the community, but also because I get to have more diversity with a rain garden than I ever would otherwise. Having that low-lying section is a place where we can grow plants that are not possible to grow in other high dry areas. I live on top of a hill in San Marcos, so you know, keeping the water on that hill rather than it running off into the Blanco or San Marcos River is really important. I want to keep the sacred springs at Spring Lake flowing. So I've said rain garden, rain garden, rain garden. What is that? So rainscaping or a rain garden is a type of xeriscaping that is all about making the most of the rainfall that we have in Central Texas. 34 inches a year on average, sometimes more in major rainy years, oftentimes a lot less. But we want to hold on to that and put it into our springs, put it into the aquifer so that we have it for longer. So a rain garden is comprised of a basin where the water can sit, and it's comprised of berms that help to hold the water in that place. We also use deep-rooted native plants. This is a great opportunity to restore our native prairie where there's less than 1% of that ecosystem left. Those grasses are excellent at slowing the water and sinking it down deep into the soil profile so we get deep infiltration rather than shallow infiltration. And deep infiltration is how we get more groundwater. Who doesn't want more groundwater? Come on, this is Central Texas. Lots of straws are going in. Like you mentioned, lots and lots of straws into the aquifer. Well, what do we do to give back? That's what this is about. So the basin, that's where we give back. The water collects in this basin. It fills up when it's raining, and within a few hours, it's gone. Where did it go? It didn't run off down the street into a storm drain. It sunk into the soil profile. Placement of a basin is also really important. We do watershed analysis maps. We take a precise and analytical approach to this. My background is as a scientist. That's my field of study. We use GIS, geographic information systems, and we want to understand, well, where is the water actually flowing through the landscape? If we miss it by 3 feet, a mentor of mine literally did this. They built a bunch of earthworks and missed a major watershed opportunity by 3 feet. And we were only able to discover that 5 years later when we started using this technology. So looking at the existing site conditions first and knowing where the water currently flows and intercepting that right where it's flowing is critical to having really successful basins. We don't want to have a 2-inch rain event and why didn't this fill up? We also don't want to have a 1/2-inch rain event and wow, it's overflowing full. Want to size these so that it's appropriate for the amount of rainfall we expect to get. I'm probably getting too deep into the weeds here because what I'm supposed to be talking about is the native plants themselves. So I'm going to keep moving. But this is the philosophy behind it, the why, the how is this done, which if anyone's intending to build a rain garden is really critical to being successful at that. And I've learned, and my mentors have learned how to do this through a lot of trial and error. We've built over 300 rain gardens since 2017. So that's a basin. Oftentimes we do put rocks in the bottom of them to make it have an aesthetic pop. It's not necessary to have rocks in the bottom, and that's the first thing we cut usually if we're looking at what we can do with the budget. Berm. A berm is the opposite of the basin. When I come through with my excavator, I dig out the basin part, make that nice bowl, and where does the soil that came out of that basin go? Well, we just flip it over to create a berm. We're not hauling it off the site and putting it somewhere else. No, use it right here. Those berms allow us to put in plants like the lantana that like to sit high and dry. If you put a lantana in a rain garden basin, it will probably drown, not this year because it's so dry, but one of those really rainy, wet years that will eventually come again, it would definitely drown. So again, there's that huge amount of diversity by having these varied microclimates in a rainscape. What we do, we flip that soil over and then we put organic compost and hardwood mulch blend on the top of that so that we give the fertility that the plants need to thrive. Those plants that are on the berm are especially important because they are going to use their roots to lock that berm together so that when a lot of water hits that berm and there's a bunch of weight on it, the plants help hold it stable. And this is a rainscape with quite a few berms. Is there that little laser clicker? Well, here, I'll just do this. So this right here, that's a berm. There's a berm up in here. Quite a few berms in this one. There's berms over here. A lot of these areas that you see being mulched that are next to the river rock, those are berm spaces. And then the third component of rainscapes is called a dry creek. A dry creek is a fancy word for a trench. A lot of people will make dry creeks that are just rocks laid on top of the ground with weed barrier underneath it. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is a conveyance structure. We carefully grade it so that it has the appropriate amount of fall, which is, I won't quote the numbers at you. I've been told that that's just getting too deep in the weeds, but we want to make sure that it isn't too steep and it's not too shallow, because too steep, lots of erosion. Too shallow, well, the water's not going to move through it the way we want and it gets stuck. So we dig out these dry creeks, make sure the water flows through them the way we want using a tool called an altimeter or a zip level. And then we backfill it with river rock. This is an essential place, has to have some sort of river rock in it or rock in general. Otherwise, it'll become a tripping hazard and it will erode. So really critical there. And what we have here is an example of 2 rain garden basins that are connected by a dry creek. So before I get into the plants, it is my job to say, hey, guess what? We're having native plant sales once a month, first Saturday of every month. We carry about 250 different species of native plants. We don't have all of those at all times, but we do carry a significant diversity. That's one of the things I pride myself on, is being able to bring out really rare native plants to both our landscaping clients and making them available to people who don't want to buy a whole landscape. In order to find out more about that, please check out our website, eranativeland.com, and sign up for our newsletter to get the monthly availability. Okay, enough sales pitch, we're done with that. Okay, sunny berm plants. When we have high and dry spaces, we want to have plants that like high and dry places. So, for example, that would be blanket flower. This is a really popular one. Indian blanket's another name. Firewheel's another name. We like to place these on the berms. Usually this is one that we'll go ahead and throw seeds for rather than planting live roots. And it's absolutely stunningly beautiful, has a moderate level of deer resistance, and the butterflies around it are gorgeous. I imagine a lot of y'all, since you're Native Plant Society people, are like, oh yeah, I know that one. But it is a short-lived perennial and reseeds each year. Next, we have snake herb. This is a really cute little brown cover. It does not attract snakes. I get that question all the time. It's like, oh no, I don't want snake herb. That'll bring snakes to my yard. No. First of all, checkered garter snakes, so cool. Indigo snakes, coach webbers, come on. But no, it does not attract snakes. It's named as snake herb because of how sinuous its stem is as it lays along the ground. Really beautiful little violet flowers, super drought hardy, loves rock gardens. So out here in these dry hillsides, great plant to plant unless you have a ton of deer, because its deer resistance is not super high. In fact, it's pretty low. But to talk about one that does have really high deer resistance, mealy blue sage is one of those pretty much bulletproof deer resistant plants. If the deer are eating lantana and the deer are eating mealy blue sage, whoa, we have some serious issues, which has been some of the neighborhoods I've worked in. And then it's like, well, what can we do to fence them out of these native garden spaces? Because this is, a broader problem within this neighborhood that's, well, I won't go into politics, but there's certain solutions that might need to be applied to too many deer, and especially people feeding the deer in their yards. But I'm talking about mealy blue sage, which I have seen growing on game ranches that are way overstocked. So it is a really highly deer resistant plant. The pipevine swallowtails are all over it. It's really gorgeous to see them. Also, hummingbirds love these flowers. And it gets quite tall, and it has two flushes of blooms, an early flush around May, and then later on in the season, if there's enough water, it will bloom again. This is one that's a little less common. You really probably won't find this in the native plant nurseries all that often. The velvet leaf senna, way underutilized and should be used more. Awesome plant, beautiful yellow blooms, and gets sometimes this tall. Excellent plant. Loves rocky limestone soils. Deer don't eat it. Again, another bonus for an area like this. Super low water use. And even when it's not blooming, its velvety leaves are absolutely gorgeous. And lastly, fall aster. That is another one that's super popular. Really gorgeous purple blooms in the fall. Hence the name fall aster. Not super deer resistant, but this one is a great one for the migrating monarchs because it is blooming as they are flying through. So that's really great. This is one that is kind of flexible about soil moisture. But generally speaking, we do plant it more in berms than in low-lying basins, primarily because the only basins that the fall aster will really thrive in are ones that have limestone underneath them and drain within a few hours. Whereas, if you have a more clay soil, this would be a plant that would drown. So that's why it's in the berm list. Okay, shady berms. Who has a lovely oak tree in their yard and doesn't know what to plant under it? Yeah, so these are going to be some of your friends. So we've got heartleaf skullcap. This is one that's a little bit rare in the trade and needs to be more all over the place. Great plant. So beautiful purple blooms. It has some medicinal uses for relieving anxiety. Always look that sort of thing up before using it. Give it a Google. And, you know, this is not medical advice, disclaimer. I have to carry insurance, so I gotta say that sort of thing. So this is a great one because it is mostly evergreen, highly deer resistant, perennial, and attracts a lot of butterflies and hummingbirds. I've also really enjoyed watching it in my yard because I have it planted in like a log border and it just is cascading over the log border, which is super pretty. Chili pekin, who knows this one? Yeah, who's eaten one?
I haven't eaten.
Yeah. If you like spicy stuff, this is the plant for you.
Makes good salsa.
Yeah, one or two will make you a pretty moderately hot salsa. We put two of them in a pickle jar one time, and that was too spicy for me. So.
Wow.
But edible fruit for people and for birds. Really gorgeous plant for winter interest as well, because those berries do cling on for quite a while unless you've got a ton of birds eating off of it. Fairly flexible in terms of sun requirement. It can do shade or sun. Perennial and up to 2 feet tall. Kind of is like if it's standing on its own. If it's climbing up through, like I've seen them climb up in junipers, like be like intertwined with them and get a lot taller than that because they have the support of that tree to grow through. And it has a lot of different soil types that it'll handle: clay, sandy, loam. Horseherb, another great ground cover, or well, heartleaf skullcap is kind of a ground cover as well. Horseherb is one of our favorites for people that say, well, I don't want to have a lawn, but I do want to be able to walk around. Well, this is a great one for that because it is fairly low growing. It forms a nice carpet under the shade of trees. And so you can have your picnic table and have that nice turfy appearance and eat your cake and all of that. You're having your cake, eating it too. Horseherb is an awesome little ground cover. Has little blooms that the pollinators love, and doesn't get too tall. You can mow over it. Unfortunately, it's not really available by seeds. Most of the time we have to introduce it by plugs. Someone should get on that. Let's talk to the Neiman's. This is also bringing to mind, there are a lot of plants that I couldn't fit on this list. Another one that's very similar to horseherb and spreads really readily is called spot flower. It's a little more rare, awesome little ground cover. It's like if frog fruit and horseherb had a baby, that's spot flower. Super. It acts like a little bit of both. Super tough little plant.
My dear, like horseherb.
Bomar. Yeah. Anything that's green at this time of year, right?
Well, they've pretty much been eating it all year. Yeah, really spring there.
Yeah, deer resistance, I like to say, is a spectrum that primarily depends on how hungry the deer really are in any particular area. Pigeonberry is one that I have seen sometimes be eaten by deer, sometimes not be eaten by deer. It has little orange fruits and or red fruits and little white flowers. Sometimes it'll even have the white pink flowers and the red fruits on it at the same time. It's really cute, low growing, almost like it would be fitting in a fairy garden. And depending on soil type, it can handle a little more moisture than some of the other plants on this list. So it wouldn't drown if it's in a basin that drains rapidly, but if you have one that holds water for more like 24 or 36 hours, then this would probably drown. So Understanding soil type is a big part of this as well, which goes hand in hand with native plants, because so much of working with native plants is, well, which soil type does this one like? And speaking of fairy gardens, purple leather flower. These are awesome. They look like little fairy hats, little bells. Hummingbirds will fly up underneath them and like drink from them with their head up like this. It's so cool to watch. They can grow quite tall and are a really great vine for climbing up trellises. They're not too aggressive. I have one that's growing up along the front porch of my house, and it's not like cross vine where I'd be worried about it eating the house. This is a nice, gentle, delicate vine. Much like coral honeysuckle is a good, delicate vine for that situation. Oh, and when they go to seed, the seeds even look cool. So after the flower, they have really another level of seasonal interest. Yeah.
Yeah, there's some types of clematis that have to be pruned back and some that don't. This does not need pruning.
I haven't encountered needing to prune it. I've had mine for, this is its second year. It got pruned by the grasshoppers for me. It's still got the seeds on it, but with the heat and drought, I think it's actually beneficial to the plant to have the grasshoppers reduce its leaf mass, because it's going to lose a lot of water through its leaves. And so I'm actually not concerned about the plant coming back next year, even with the grasshoppers feeding on it. I think they have a role that they're playing in the ecosystem. But I haven't felt like it needs to be pruned back. We'll talk again in 5 years and we'll see if my opinion's the same, but I haven't gotten concerned about it being too aggressive yet. Okay, sunny basins. So a basin, like I said, that's a low-lying area. Your plants that are more drought hardy and like to be on berms will potentially drown in basins when we have those heavy rain events. So it's really important to select basin plants to be able to handle some temporary inundation, sometimes 24 to 48 hours, which brings me to another frequently asked question about rain gardens. Isn't that going to breed mosquitoes? If they drain within 48 hours, the mosquitoes don't have time to breed, and it actually acts as a mosquito trap. They might lay their eggs in it and then the water is gone into the ground. But again, that's a soil type thing that we want to look at, whether it's heavy clay or whether it's limestone. Limestone, I like try and catch the rain sitting in my basins in front of my house. I'm like running out there. I'm like, no, don't drain yet. I haven't seen how much water's in there. Because within 30 minutes to an hour, it's back into the aquifer. So Texas bluebells, Sarah mentioned that was the picture y'all used for me. I absolutely love these. So gorgeous. Really needs to be in the native plant trade more. If you want a plant that will make people fall in love with native plants, this one. Absolutely this one. People, when they come to our sales and mine's still blooming, they're like, oh my God, what is that? And I'm like, oh, that's the Texas bluebells. We're sold out actually. Happened in the first week. That said, we only had 3 of them. So anyway, this plant behaves differently based on where it is. Sometimes it acts like an annual, sometimes biennial, sometimes perennial. Mine has held on for 2 years. This is a 2-year-old specimen. So I originally had learned it as an annual and got super excited that mine had stuck around, but apparently that's not as uncommon as I thought. Here I was thinking I was just awesome and doing something. Next, another blue plant, blue flag iris. So this is our native iris to the southern part of the US. Super beautiful. One of the reasons I like to use it is because I do have some people that want a more formal looking native garden. They might have called me not because they know about they want native plants, but because they have a serious drainage issue that I'm trying to solve. And they're like, whoa, native plants, like, is that gonna look wild? I'm scared. So it's like, okay, well, sometimes we're gonna design this in a way that's a little more formal and a little more matching the aesthetic of your traditional garden with plants that have spaces in between. That said, blue flag iris does tend to spread by rhizome, but a lot of people are familiar with irises and will be happy with an iris patch. So this is the only iris that I actually use with our company because it is our native iris. If I could get my hands on the copper iris though, we do have a copper colored one that's native. I just haven't been able to find it. Once I do, it's gonna be in our collection. Swamp milkweed. There's milkweeds that love a lot of water. Ooh, both swamp milkweed and aquatic milkweed. So this is appropriate for basins. Our Zozotes milkweed, green milkweed, Antiloporus milkweed, those would all be sunny berm plants, but the swamp milkweed is a milkweed that I can use in basins and have all of that extra diversity. This would absolutely die if it was placed on a berm, but by having that basin, we get that extra level of diversity. Again, soil type. Would I plant this in a limestone, this much soil kind of situation? Probably not, because the water is going to drain away too rapidly. And this plant really does love more clay type soil that holds water for a little bit longer. You're the Native Plant Society. I don't necessarily need to say that milkweed is a host plant for monarch butterflies, but I'm going to say it anyway, because, you know, people on Zoom may be just coming into this for the first time. So milkweeds are awesome because they host those monarch butterflies that are, you know, struggling to keep their population up. And we can help by planting all types of milkweeds. Elderberry, this one's really cool. Lots of medicinal uses. Who's ever bought elderberry syrup at the store?
Have elderberry.
Yeah, awesome. I like to have elderberries in our rain gardens because it provides that combination of humans thriving and wildlife thriving together. We have similar needs to each other. So the elderberry is great. Don't plant it near your water line, it'll eat your water line. Plant it far away from a house because it does tend to spread rhizomatously, so you're going to have more popping up to share with your Native Plant Society friends and donate to y'all's plant sales. So really awesome plant. It does have some toxic parts, so you want to know how to use it. Again, I'm not a medical expert telling you to eat this plant. I'm saying look into this. This is fascinating. Because it is such a fast growing and colony forming species, it is great for erosion control. The genetics that we have at our nursery came from along a place on the Blanco River, and it was forming a colony, and you could see that where that colony was, the soil was actually building rather than being torn apart by erosion, which is a huge issue on the Blanco River. And we took only a few. It was very sustainable, had permission. Okay. Swamp sunflower. This one's pretty neat. Maximilian sunflower, while I would love to use it in every single garden I ever do, it gets quite large and whoa, that's too much sunflower. So the sunflower that I'll use more often in more of a like, let's keep this, at a reasonable height rather than like, oh God, it's as tall as the house situation. Swamp sunflower is a great option for that. And it does a very similar function in the ecosystem, providing nectar for pollinators and bird seed once it goes to seed. Which brings me around to another commonly asked question is, should I cut the flowers off once they, aren't flowering? Do you want free bird seed? You can keep it blooming longer, or you can just, let it go to seed. You might get more sunflowers popping up later, and also you're feeding the birds. So I take a fairly light hand on maintenance to get that full benefit of this plant. Okay, shady basin plants. So there are low-lying wet areas that are in the shade, and some of these plants are a little less common in the hill country because things are getting clear cut so much, things are drying up. So getting to have some of these more rare plants, and I'll get to one that's particularly rare here in a minute, is really special and important. And some of them reproduce readily on their own. This golden groundfelt is a great one for buy one, get 20 free the next year. It has a, really beautiful yellow flowers, and along the ground has a little basal rosette that has a nice green color to it, even in the wintertime. Very early spring blooms. So when you're designing a native plant garden, you want to make sure that the bees and the butterflies have food from January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, and December. You don't want to go to the grocery store one day and the shelves are empty and it's COVID 2.0, right? That was terrifying, right? If you have a garden that only has blooms in March, well, that's what you're leaving the grocery store shelves bare for your pollinators for 11 months out of the year. So a big goal is to find something to provide in all times of year. And this is a great one for your early spring blooms.
Where do you find rich acidic soils?
Actually, the cedar trees, the duff from them has a more acid component, and also the lost pines out in Bastrop, that's another acid soil. We serve a pretty broad area of central Texas, but I would say that that's more of a suggestion rather than a rule, because I have it growing in calcareous soil on top of a limestone hill, and it's not angry, it works. So big red sage. This one's really cool and exciting because we thought it was gone and then it was rediscovered, and really beautiful, tall, almost purple red blooms. And it likes these limestone hills. So great for this area. It reseeds readily. So it's a little surprising that it vanished so much and was thought to be extinct when it reseeds and spreads so readily. Part of the reason that it disappeared so much is likely due to cattle, goats, and deer. So minimally deer resistant plant. If you want to have one, yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, you probably know the story behind how it was discovered.
Yeah.
Share that.
Yeah, oh, so I don't know the full details, but it was basically discovered in an isolated pocket and then propagated from there.
Story I heard was a biologist saw a photo of this person, and it was about this guy, but behind him was his plant. He said, "Oh my gosh, I think that thing was extinct," and so he kind of followed up on it and found out where the guy took that photo.
Oh, how cool. Yeah, I didn't hear that detail of it. So if you were to want to plant something like this that's minimally deer resistant, one thing that I like to do, and this is kind of like, rather than building a little cage around each one, my pro tip is go to antique stores and get bird cages, like antique bird cages. Some of them are pretty cute looking. And then you put them over the plant that's super deer sensitive, and voila, you have a feature of your garden, and you're getting to keep that native plant diversity that would normally be eaten by deer with very minimal effort. Two-flower millet grass. This one is one that I've recently gotten super excited about because it just has such a beautiful texture. Of those little seed heads. It's a fairly low growing grass, grows well in shady area. Finding shade friendly grasses is tough, and this is one that'll do it. And this is a rather rare one in the trade, and one that we are readily like, let's bump that up and keep it going to, propagate that and use them on more of our installations, because it really is quite gorgeous and deserves as much attention as the inland sea oats. It's a little more dainty in its leaves than the inland sea oats, but grows in a very similar setting. If you have a spot where inland sea oats grows, this will also work. Dwarf palmetto, my favorite evergreen to use in rain garden basins. They get quite large apparently, I've never, other than Palmetto State Park, I don't really see them getting huge and tree-like here in Central Texas, except there is one at Spring Lake in San Marcos that is that full tree size. Generally speaking, slow growing and usually much smaller than, the 10 to 25 foot height range. They like moist soils, right? This is a basin plant, likes those moist, deep soils, lots of clay. I am currently trying to grow one in the top of the limestone hill in full sun. It's not working. Don't do that. That was an experiment that's failing. I'm gonna have to dig it up and put it somewhere else because it wants deeper soil than what I'm giving. Okay, I mentioned a little teaser earlier about really rare native plants in Texas. I bet y'all thought it was the big red sage, right? No, I'm talking about cardinal flower. I've only seen this in the wild in one place along the Blanco River under the shade of the cypress trees. And it was so stunningly red with the blue of the spring water and then the white limestone cliffs. I was just like, what is that? Wow. Went and looked it up. Cardinal flower. It's a lot more common in the Northeast. I've seen it in Maryland and all over the place. I've seen it in Maine all over the place. Pretty rare here in Texas because, again, it needs that moisture and it needs shade. It will grow in the sun in Maryland and in Maine, but it does not like the sun here. This is definitely a shade plant here. Likes quite a bit of water, but when you have a rain garden, you can introduce some of this diversity. Those basins are really a place where you can get a new microclimate going where you get to have some of these more unusual plants to the area. Great for hummingbirds, naturally lovely red blooms. It is a fairly toxic plant. I wouldn't necessarily plant it if you kind of like datura. Like it has a lot of medicinal uses for the people that know what they're doing with it, but also don't like let your kid chew on it or something. That would be bad. So that was the shady basin plants. And then there are a lot of plants that were like, well, it could do this over here, it could do this over here, pretty flexible. We can put it basically wherever. Again, that does somewhat depend on soil type, but we generally look at these as more flexible and we'll use them either in basins or in berms. Rattlesnake master, really cool native plant. Often seen more in the Gulf Coast prairies where there's more clay soil. It does like that heavier clay. Really, really neat bloom stalks and attracts wasps and other helper insects. I don't look at wasps as like, scary. There's some wasps that are quite helpful in terms of controlling other insect populations that could be detrimental. It also is great for little butterflies as well. So really cool little plant, evergreen, yucca-like leaves at the base. Not particularly spiky, just a little bit at the tips late in the summer. And then on the bloom stalk, there is a spiky part there. Purple cone flower. This is a really popular one. A lot of people know purple cone flower. It's gorgeous. Has a lot of medicinal uses. This is one that we say, oh yeah, sometimes we'll put that in, a basin. Sometimes we'll put that in a berm, just depending on soil conditions. It does have an endemic relative that is from the Texas Hill Country that sometimes I prefer to use. And if there were more of it available, I'd use it all the time. It's the narrow leaf coneflower, the Echinacea angustifolia. The narrower leaves and the hairs on it make it more drought hardy, which we probably need more drought hardy plants in this area. I would never put a narrow leaf coneflower in a basin because it would drown, but purple coneflower can sometimes go in basins. So just because things look similar or seem similar doesn't necessarily mean that you can just kind of guess at which place it would go to. The best way to find out if a new unfamiliar plant is going to be something for a berm or a basin is to scroll down to the very bottom of the Wildflower Center's page about that plant. and look for if it says FACW, that means facultative wetland plant. And that would mean that it can handle some inundation. If it says OBL, that means it's an obligate wetland plant, must stay wet all the time. And then there's facultative upland plants that are either one. Our flexible plants are kind of the facultative upland. And then it has the label for just upland. Do not plant this anywhere where there's going to be a lot of water. So for those of you who want to go and look into plants more in terms of where they would be placed in a rain garden setting, that's how to look it up. I will say about the rattlesnake master, going back, even though it looks like a yucca, it likes water. It likes mostly to sit in those less well-drained places, but in some areas it can handle just being planted on flat ground because the clay soil holds so much water anyway that it's fine. If you're planting a rattlesnake master in kind of a more quickly draining soil, I would say that's a basic plant. Yarrow, another really popular one, lots of medicinal uses, really, really beautiful little plant, dainty fern-like leaves. We love to use this on like borders because it's like, oh, look, ferns, it looks like ferns. And also has that ability to help stop bleeding and has a special value to our native bees. Just a really great little plant. I have planted this both in basins, in dry limestone areas, and in berms and more clayey soil. Wine cup, this is another really cute one for a low growing plant. The tubers are apparently edible. I haven't tried it, but Meriwether's Foraging Texas has information on that. It's pretty short. There's two types. There's the perennial wine cup and the annual wine cup. Here I'm referring to the perennial wine cup. It's more of a long-lasting ground cover, whereas the annual wine cup grows more upright. The deer will eat this one if they can, so not a great choice if you're in an area with a bunch of deer, but it is great as a larval host. And when it does rain, it will often have secondary flushes of blooms, which is very similar to our next plant, the pink evening primrose, which will, when it finally rains again, sometimes have new flushes of blooms even later into the season. This is probably one of my favorite little low ground cover plants. You can mow it and you can eat it even better. The leaves are edible, but they're high in oxalic acid, so you would want to cook them first, like they're like spinach. Then the blooms are like butter crunch lettuce. They've got a nice silky texture, really nice flavor, and those can be eaten raw. I used to do this trick where I would put them on my burgers. People like, what? Yeah.
The slide said it goes up to 6 feet tall.
You know what? That is probably supposed to be inches.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Good catch. I'll fix that one later. Making notes. And then we have some plants that will handle flexible moisture in the shade. The first one, fall obedient plant. This one is one that, like, here in the hill country, I'm like, that's a basin plant that needs to have a lot of water to thrive. Back in Houston, where I grew up, at the Clear Lake Native Plant Society chapter, yeah, that was definitely a plant that could just be planted anywhere and would thrive just fine because of the heavy clay soils. It will spread aggressively. I don't actually even like the term aggressive with native plants. We call this one disobedient or bossy. So funny that it's called obedient plant. Apparently that's because of bending the stems, but it will spread everywhere, which when I'm doing a big landscape where I want to fill a huge space with native plants, I want the aggressively spreading ones, especially if there's some invasive plants in that area. Let's choke out Bermuda grass with lots and lots of fall obedient plant, because Bermuda grass needs a lot of sun. If you shade it out, not a problem. So I'm currently testing that theory out at my house. I've got a big patch of fall obedient plant and I'm trying to choke out the Bermuda grass that was there with it. So far it is working. But the Bermuda probably wants to go dormant anyway. Inland sea oats is the next one that is a variable moisture. Generally speaking, here in the hill country, wetter areas, other parts of other areas, you might find that, oh yeah, this grows just fine in, a flat site rather than, being planted in a basin. Like I mentioned with the 2-flower melic, these two are both wonderful little shade-friendly grasses. And it will handle those like really heavy clays that are poorly draining. Looks lovely with the seed heads fluttering in the wind. So their name was fish on a pole grass because those little dangling seeds look like a fish hanging off of a pole. They have a really cute herringbone pattern. Like most grasses, they are highly deer resistant. When I have a client that's like, there's a lot of deer in the neighborhood, I'm like, yeah, there's a lot of deer. And like, we're gonna have to go with a bunch of grasses and spiky stuff. If you don't like spiky, it's gonna be grasses and some mealy blue sage.
Again, they don't always read that deer resistant stuff.
No, they
But
don't.
I need it.
Yeah, depends how hungry they are. I could talk for an hour about how hungry the hill country deer are and what some potential solutions to that are, but anyway, yeah.
Sometimes if you give them the list, they'll eat the list too.
Maybe we just feed them the list and get them so they're not as hungry. Turk's cap, this is another really great one. It says moderate deer resistant. Depends how hungry the deer are. If they're hungry, yes, they will eat this one. They'll even eat lantana if they're hungry enough. In really wet locations, this plant can get very, very tall. I've never seen it get to 10 feet, but that's what the internet says. And I'm like, let's see it top out about here, but okay. It is a perennial shrub, but it is herbaceous. So in the summer season, it's going to grow really tall. And then we're going to get that first freeze and it's going to die back all the way to the ground. Chop that off or leave it for the pollinators to overwinter in if you can stand how it looks. That's a great benefit to the providing shelter component for pollinators. One thing I love about Turk's cap, this is one of the plants I've known for the longest. I've known it since I was 8 back in Houston. It's really cool because the new leaves are edible, like the fresh soft ones. The flowers are edible, really cute to put on like cupcakes or in salad. And then the fruits are edible. The fruits are called manzanita in Spanish, meaning little apple. And they do taste like little apples, but like most native plants, they are full of seeds. So just be prepared for that. Fairly drought tolerant, but they do prefer a little more moisture. Again, hill country, I would say basin plant. Other places that are more moist, it would be a berm plant. White mist flower. This is really, really cool. I see them sometimes out like toward Medina. They're just growing right out of the side of a rock face. Oftentimes also growing out of that rock face, though, there's some maidenhair ferns. So I think there's some seeps there, right? So they do like a little bit more moisture, but they like it to be draining rather than, the moisture of heavy clay is a different type of moisture than a limestone seep. So making the distinction between soils that drain really well and soils that hold a lot of moisture, and different plants like that moisture in different ways. This is another great one, like the fall aster, lovely pairing, by the way, white mist flower and fall aster, because the migrating monarchs, these are going to bloom at the same time and provide a really nice source of nectar. So fairly drought tolerant, but it does seem to prefer a little extra moisture. Scarlet sage, remember that thing I said about trying to find something that blooms in all seasons? This is the longest bloomer I have seen into the late season. I have definitely seen it blooming at Christmas and took a picture of it. It was like, a bloom for December. So, and that was on a mild year, naturally. It wasn't after, a big freeze like we had this year. But it's pretty neat to have something that is providing that color and nectar source even that late into the season. This is one that is fairly flexible. If it's in the sun, water, it would need to be in a basin. If it's in the shade, it can be a berm plant. And this is another one of those buy one, get 20 free the following year type plants. Just like Flamacanthus and Follopedia plant would also be on the reseeds readily list, or reproduces by rhizomes readily list. And that's my short list of native plants. I do want to say, my job as the business owner is to say, don't break your back, right? If you want a rain garden, I've got that little machine. I got that little machine so that I wouldn't break my back. And in an hour on that, I can do what it used to take a team of 4 guys all day to do.
It also goes through gates.
It does. You see these tracks, they're retracted to 28 inches. I could drive it into this building. Canopy folds down. Awesome. Super compact. Love it. Love my little machine. Like, yeah, super handy. Like I was saying before, if you had told me when I was a child that I would be using something like this for ecological restoration, I would have thought you were pulling my leg. But it depends on whose hands the tool is in. And this can definitely be a tool for regeneration, for more water, more wildlife, which is what we're all about. And if you want to learn more about what we do, or just come visit one of our native plant sales, see a rain garden in person, you can find out more at eranativesland.com. That's where you'll find the availability and the address to our home where we host our native plant sales and have our demonstration rain gardens. So, thank you all for listening.
Do you propagate native plants, or do you buy them, or a combination?
Combination, a little of column A, a little of column B. We do shop from about 12 different nurseries. I'm often going to far-flung, isolated, little known about nurseries and bringing rare stuff back. Also, sometimes we make trips to Dallas and Fort Worth to bring stuff back. I do have some suppliers that, these aren't necessarily like the local genetics, but there are some times where it's like, well, we need a bunch of these for a, landscape where it's not super critical, but they are local genetics. And I have a supplier in Georgia and a supplier in North Carolina as well for some of the, the little plugs of grasses that we need in more bulk than I can supply them. We are ramping up our production. There are some things that on our availability list will be listed as specialty, and those are usually things that we propagate in-house. The local blue mist flower, not the Greg's mist. Greg's mist is a West Texas native. There's Conoclinium colestum, which is from Central Texas specifically. That's one of ours that we propagate. And there's a couple others, Ludwigio tivalis, which is a great wetland plant. It's a water primrose. That's one that we propagate as well. And the list goes on. I won't just list it. I won't go too deep into the weeds on that one, but.
You mentioned your machinery there, that's retractable, so it'll get wider and narrower. Cool.
Yeah, it's
It's a
super
lot more
fun.
stability when you're working so hard, right?
Yeah, when we're digging, we want them wide, but if we need to get through a gate, all I need is 28 inches and I can fit.
Wow.
What?
That's amazing.
28 inches, yeah.
Yeah.
Some of us couldn't operate that thing. Get through the-
It takes some practice to be able to fit through the narrow spaces. There have been moments where I've been like,
We know what Leon wants for Christmas.
hey, it's an expensive gift. A big investment on those. But yeah, it does incredible work for, making landscapes happen. And we can make a rain garden in it, fully planted in a day, plants, rocks, mulch, everything one day, just from bare ground. But we do a lot of prep work and planning before that, like I mentioned briefly, watershed analysis. If I'm gonna do work like that and bring out heavy equipment, that's an expensive day. We wanna make sure we get it right the first time and don't bring out that equipment again because oops, we missed. So that's why we do those watershed analysis maps that I have an example of over on the back table. Proper prior planning is how I like to operate. And we do designs that allow us to get estimates on materials so that, you know, if we need 10 yards of mulch, we're getting 10 yards of mulch, not 20 yards of mulch, oops, or we need another dump truck because we only got 5. So having that, you know, watershed analysis to know where to put the rain garden and how much water we can expect to catch is really critical. And then with our design process, we're able to say, okay, how many plants do we need? How much mulch do we need? How much stone do we need? And really dial that in so that when we do come out boots on the ground, we're extremely efficient and extremely precise. So, yeah.
Are you using radar or laser or drone?
So the watershed analysis is completed using LiDAR data. So the counties fly planes over, they bounce lasers up off the ground, and based on the rate of return of the laser bouncing off the ground and getting back to the plane, they're able to create what is called a point cloud, which means millions and millions of data points communicating various types of information. Then that information is processed through a program like ArcGIS, Geographic Information Systems. And with that, we're able to break down, okay, like where is the low point? Where's that water going to flow when it's raining? How much area feeds into that network line? Yeah.
So I know Comal County is tied into GIS, but I don't think I've ever seen anything that detailed.
Yeah, it takes quite a bit of processing. The data that is available isn't just in a format that automatically has the watershed information on it. I mean, the information is there in the point cloud, but it just is, it's just a cloud of points until you run it through the processes that like clean it up. It would be like, you know, looking at a bunch of binary code, right? Where it's like, oh God, what is this? And it's like, oh, that's the letter N or R, or, you know, it's just, so programs are cool for helping do that. Science, landscaping science. Yeah.
How do the basin plants fare when we've got weather like this where you have no rain for months and 105-degree temperatures?
Yeah.
Do they survive?
Yeah, that is a great question. So I'm so glad you asked, because there is a feature of under the ground, what is referred to as a swale plume. And this is a term that was coined by permaculture. And basically what it is when you create that bowl, on the downhill side of that bowl, well, the water collects here and it sinks into the soil. And the soil has a water storage capacity. Water in the soil stays a lot longer than water on the surface and a lot longer than water on blacktop. So that subsurface moisture is referred to as a swale plume. And downhill of a rain garden, there is more moisture in the soil for longer. So the bluebells that I showed in my slide, those like quite a bit of moisture. They are in a rain garden basin at my house that is on rocky limestone soil, and that is supposed to be a more clay soil plant, and it is still thriving and blooming, and I have watered twice since the rain stopped. So pretty incredible how when we store the water in the soil, it sticks around longer for our plants. You wouldn't want, you know, a true wetland plant. Like if I planted pickerweed in my basin, yeah, it would die. But that's where that facultative wetland plant component really comes in and is important. So a lot of it is like fine tuning that plant selection. And I do have some plants that are in my rain garden that were doing better prior to the drought and are now like, I had a Texas spider lily in there. I don't know if I'll see it again. We'll see. You know, it's a little bit of an experiment. The dwarf palmetto is barely hanging on because it's like full sun and on top of it's got this much soil. But basically, the answer to your question, short form is it depends which plant it is, but it is amazing how this technique makes that soil moisture available for longer. And there are some tricks of the trade in terms of like introducing more organic matter into the soil helps the water stay in the soil longer. Anyway, that could in itself, the soil conditioning to help it retain moisture could be a whole nother talk. So I won't get too deep into the weeds again, but yeah. That answer your question?
Yes.
So what kind of soil depth are you talking about on the blue?
What?
What's the soil depth? on the-
Oh, yeah, so that's another great question, and the science on that is still happening. So the Greater Edwards Aquifer Authority is now doing some testing where they have had rain gardens. They're referring to them as swales. Swale is another term for basin. They've had those constructed on a contour at a test site, and they have a device that they are using to measure the soil moisture and how far down it goes. So we are eagerly awaiting the results of that information. And I imagine the depth would have to do with, again, soil type, depth to bedrock, that sort of thing.
On the bluebells, how deep do the roots get?
Oh, I'm not actually sure. I imagine on mine, not particularly deep, because it is on a limestone shelf. Sarah, you've seen where that is. It's shelf. We got like 2 inches down before we hit limestone shelf, and I planted it when it was teeny tiny, and I think it's found its way around the rocks.
Hey, Dick, did you let the bluebell as the host plant for ice cream?
That sounds pretty good in this kind of weather. That's awesome. It is an ice cream
Bluebell
plant.
ice cream was named after the bluebell though, and wasn't the bluebell in contention to be a state flower at one point? Instead of the
don't know.
bluebonnet?
I don't know, but I'd vote for it. Anyone else? Questions? Are there any from the Zoom audience there?
No, nothing on chat.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for
Well,
listening to me
you.
talk about my cat.
Many, we don't do.
We got 25 here.